The tears wouldn't stop falling, no matter how hard Zephyra Grant tried to contain them. Wyoming Territory, 1878, a land where stoicism was as necessary as water, and public displays of emotion were considered weakness, especially in the rough-hewn timber walls of St. Louis' only church. 6 months a widow, and the grief still cut as fresh as the day they'd lowered Thomas into the unforgiving ground, the morning sermon had begun ordinarily enough. Reverend Collins spoke of redemption and heavenly rewards, words that should have offered comfort. Instead, they pierced Zephyra's heart with memories of her husband's final days feverish and wasting from consumption that no doctor could cure. When the congregation rose to sing Amazing Grace, something inside her shattered. The first tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another and another until her shoulders shook with the effort of containing her sobs. The whispers started immediately. In a town where everyone's business was common knowledge, Zephyra's grief had long since worn out its welcome. Still carrying on after half a year, Martha Wilkinson muttered loud enough for those in neighboring pews to hear. Indecent display if you ask me. Some people enjoy attention, agreed Alina Phillips, her voice equally unsubtle. Zephyra heard them, of course, everyone did. The church was not large, and sound carried well across the hard wooden pews. She tried to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had once belonged to Thomas, but the tears would not obey her will. Each disapproving glance only intensified her shame, making the grief spiral further out of control. It was at that moment that the church door creaked open, admitting a late arrival. Heads turned as Yorick Hawthorne stepped inside, removing his hat with a nod of apology to Reverend Collins. The newcomer to St. Louis was already the subject of much speculation, a man who kept to himself, who'd arrived 6 weeks earlier and taken up residence at the edge of town, working as a ranch hand at the Ferguson place. His presence at church was unexpected. Yorick slipped into the back pew, intending to remain unnoticed, when he heard the cruel whispers directed at the woman weeping several rows ahead. His gaze found Zephyra's slender shoulders trembling beneath a black dress that had seen better days, honey blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that emphasized the pallor of her downturned face. She ought to be removed, someone near him muttered. Disrupting the Lord's service with such carrying on. Yorick's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of human cruelty to last several lifetimes. Without considering the consequences, he rose from his seat and walked forward, his boots making measured sounds against the wooden floor. The congregation fell silent as he approached Zephyra's pew and slid in beside her. She looked up, startled by his presence, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. For a moment, their gazes locked, her tear-filled hazel eyes meeting his steady gray ones. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence, "don't mind them none." Then louder so the entire congregation could hear, "If you're crying, then I'll cry beside you too." With that, he took out his own handkerchief and dabbed at his eyes, making no effort to disguise his actions. The gesture wasn't theatrical or mocking, it held a simple dignity that rendered the previous whispers instantly shameful. Reverend Collins cleared his throat. "Let us continue with the hymn," he said, recognizing the moment for what it was, a rebuke to those who'd forgotten the Christian virtues they claimed to uphold. As the congregation resumed singing, Yorick remained beside Zephyra, a steady presence while she gradually composed herself. When the service ended, he stood and offered her his arm. "Yorick Hawthorne," he said simply. "Zephyra Grant," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks. Some folks forget what it means to have a heart." He escorted her down the aisle, aware of the stares following them but unconcerned by them. "May I see you home, Mrs. Grant?" she hesitated, conscious of the town's scrutiny. A widow being escorted by a strange man would certainly fuel gossip. But the thought of walking alone past the judgmental gazes seemed unbearable. "Yes," she decided. "Thank you." Outside, the September sun bathed the dusty main street of St. Louis in golden light. The Wyoming Territory spread vast around them, mountains blue in the distance, the prairie dotted with sage and scrub. The town itself was modest but growing. A general store, saloon, blacksmith, and scattered homes spreading outward from the church at its center. "I live just past the mercantile," Zephyra said, adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. The church crowd dispersed around them, some openly staring, others pretending not to notice as they hurried to Sunday dinner. "I know," Yorick replied, then added hastily, "I mean, I've seen you hanging laundry when I ride to the Ferguson place. You work for Mr. Ferguson? Since I arrived, I break horses mainly. That's dangerous work." A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "Less dangerous than some things I've done." They walked in silence for a moment, Zephyra grateful that he didn't press her to talk. When they reached her small clapboard house, she paused at the gate. "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Hawthorne? It seems the least I can offer." He studied her face, noting the exhaustion etched there. "Another time, perhaps. You look like you could use some rest after." He didn't finish the sentence. After making a spectacle of myself, she attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. After being brave enough to feel something real in a town that's forgotten how. He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "Sunday next, I'll save you a seat if you'd like. Might be easier to face them with someone beside you." Zephyra watched him walk away, his tall figure straight-backed and unhurried. Only when he disappeared around the corner did she enter her empty house, wondering at the strange turn her morning had taken. Inside, the familiar silence greeted her. Thomas's chair still sat angled toward the fireplace, his pipe on the mantel, his boots by the door all untouched since his passing. She'd been unable to remove these remnants of him, each object a tether to the man she'd lost. She sank into her own chair, suddenly exhausted. The emotional storm at church had drained her, leaving behind a curious emptiness that wasn't entirely unpleasant. For the first time in months, someone had acknowledged her grief without offering platitudes or suggesting she simply move on. "Then I'll cry beside you too." Such a simple statement, yet it had cut through her isolation like nothing else. Who was this Yorick Hawthorne, and why had he shown such kindness to a stranger? As the afternoon light slanted through her windows, Zephyra allowed herself to wonder about him. It was the first time in 6 months she'd thought about anyone but Thomas. Monday morning brought routine back to Zephyra's life. She rose before dawn, kindled the stove fire, and prepared for another day at the mercantile where she worked 3 days weekly. The position had been a charity offering from Mr. Holloway after Thomas died, leaving her with more debts than assets. The wage was meager, but it kept a roof over her head and food on her table, if just barely. The bell above the door jingled as she entered precisely at 7. Mr. Holloway nodded from behind the counter where he was tallying the previous day's receipts. "Morning, Mrs. Grant. The new shipment of fabrics arrived yesterday. Need you to price and display them before the morning rush." "Yes, sir." She removed her shawl and set to work, grateful for tasks that occupied her hands and mind. By mid-morning, the store had filled with the usual Monday shoppers. Zephyra kept her head down, focusing on her work rather than engaging with customers who might have witnessed yesterday's church incident. But whispers followed her nonetheless. Complete breakdown in front of everyone, and then that drifter sat right beside her. Wonder what Thomas would think of such a display. She gripped the edge of the fabric counter, fighting to maintain her composure. The bell jingled again, and she looked up instinctively. Yorick Hawthorne stood in the doorway, removing his hat as his eyes scanned the store until they found her. He nodded once in acknowledgement, then approached Mr. Holloway to conduct his business. Zephyra watched from the corner of her eye as he purchased supplies: coffee, flour, tobacco. His manner was polite but reserved. When his transaction was complete, he made his way toward the door, pausing briefly at the fabric counter. "Mrs. Grant," he said with a slight tip of his head. "Mr. Hawthorne." He seemed about to say something more but glanced at the women browsing nearby who made no effort to disguise their eavesdropping. Instead, he simply nodded again and left. Minutes later, while rearranging a display of buttons, Zephyra noticed a folded piece of paper on the counter that hadn't been there before. She opened it discreetly. "Fishing at Miller's Creek this afternoon. Good spot to think without being watched. Follow the path behind the livery if you've a mind for peace." The note wasn't signed, but she knew who had left it. The invitation stirred something dormant within her: curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the desire to escape the suffocating scrutiny of the town. When her shift ended at 3 o'clock, Zephyra found herself walking not toward home but in the direction of the livery stable. She told herself she was merely taking a different route, enjoying the fine autumn day. Yet when she spotted the narrow path behind the building, she followed it without hesitation. Miller's Creek ran cool and clear about a half-mile from town, meandering through a stand of cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. As the path curved alongside the water, she caught sight of Yorick seated on a fallen log, fishing rod in hand. He didn't turn as she approached, though she was certain he'd heard her footsteps. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said when she stopped a few feet away. "Neither was I," she admitted. He gestured to the space beside him. "Fish aren't biting, but the company's improved." Zephyra settled onto the log, smoothing her skirts. "I don't know anything about fishing. Not much to know. Put the line in the water and wait. Life's simple lessons." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the gentle gurgle of the creek and occasional birdsong. Zephyra found herself relaxing, the tension of the day gradually easing from her shoulders. "Why did you help me yesterday?" she finally asked. Yorick adjusted his line before answering. "Had a wife once who cried easy. Happy tears, sad tears didn't matter. Folks would tell her to control herself like feelings were something to be ashamed of." He glanced at her. "Always thought that was backwards. World could use more honest emotion, not less." She asked softly. "She's gone. 7 years now, I'm sorry," he nodded. "Some days are still harder than others, and that's all right." The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected comfort. "Thomas, my husband, has been gone 6 months," she said. "Consumption took him. He was only 32, too young." "Yes," she twisted her wedding ring, a thin gold band that had loosened as she'd lost weight in recent months. "Everyone thinks I should be over it by now, that I'm wallowing. People forget grief doesn't follow a timetable. Did you?" She hesitated. "Did you ever feel like you were disappointing everyone by not recovering faster?" Yorick reeled in his line, examined the empty hook, then cast again before answering. "For a while. Then I realized the only person I was answerable to was myself and her memory." He looked directly at her. "Your husband, was he a good man?" "The best I've known," she said without hesitation. "Then honor him however feels right to you. Cry when you need to, laugh when you can. The rest will sort itself out." They continued talking as the afternoon lengthened into evening. Yorick spoke sparingly of himself, born in Missouri, fought for the Union in the war despite coming from a Southern family, drifted westward afterward doing various jobs. He'd been a lawman briefly in Kansas, a trail hand in Texas, a silver miner in Colorado. Wyoming was just the latest stop in what seemed a perpetual journey. Zephyra shared more readily how she'd met Thomas when he came through her hometown in Illinois selling farm equipment. How they'd married against her parents' wishes when she was just 19 and he 25. Their journey west seeking opportunity, the struggles of establishing themselves in St. Louis, and finally, the devastating illness that had claimed him far too soon. "He wanted children," she said as the sun began to set. "We tried for years, but were never blessed that way. Now I wonder if it wasn't a mercy. Being a widow with children would be even harder, I imagine, or a comfort," Yorick suggested. "Having something of him still with you." She considered this. "Perhaps, though raising them alone would be a challenge. My mother did it. Father died when I was 4, my sister just a baby. Mama kept us fed and schooled somehow." He began packing up his fishing gear. Never caught anything worth keeping, but it was a fine afternoon nonetheless. As they walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, Zephyra realized she'd spent hours in his company without once feeling the crushing weight of grief. Guilt followed immediately. Was she already forgetting Thomas? Yorick seemed to sense her thoughts. "It's not betrayal to have moments of peace," he said quietly. "The dead don't begrudge us living." At the edge of town, they parted ways, Yorick insisting on discretion for her sake. "Town's already talking, no need to add fuel. Will I see you again?" She asked, surprising herself with the question. "Sunday, if not before. I meant what I said about saving you a seat." She watched him stride away, his figure silhouetted against the last light of day, and felt something unfamiliar stir within her, not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sensation was so unexpected that she stood motionless for several minutes before continuing home. That night, for the first time since Thomas died, Zephyra slept deeply and without dreams. The week passed with unexpected swiftness. Zephyra worked her shifts at the mercantile, tended her small garden, and mended clothes for extra income. but something had shifted in her routine. She found herself looking forward rather than backward, if only in small ways anticipating the changing leaves, planning improvements to her home, wondering if Yorick might appear. He didn't come to the mercantile again, but on Thursday, a package was delivered to her door, a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson with a simple note: "Words for when your own won't come. YH." She read it by lamplight that evening, finding unexpected solace in verses penned by a woman who understood both grief and hope. Sunday arrived clear and crisp. Zephyra dressed with particular care, selecting a gray dress that, while still appropriate for mourning, wasn't the severe black she'd worn for months. She pinned her hair more softly than usual, allowing a few curls to frame her face. These small changes felt significant, like steps toward something she couldn't yet name. As she approached the church, anxiety fluttered in her chest. Would Yorick be there as promised? Would the congregation still whisper about last week's episode? He was waiting outside, hat in hand, dressed in clean but simple clothes. When he saw her, something brightened in his expression. "Mrs. Grant," he greeted her, "you look well today." "As do you, Mr. Hawthorne." They entered together, ignoring the curious glances. True to his word, Yorick led her to a pew near the back, close enough to participate, but removed enough to avoid being the center of attention. As they settled in, Martha Wilkinson and Alina Phillips turned to stare openly, their disapproval evident. "Pay them no mind," Yorick whispered. "They've likely never felt anything deeply enough to understand." The service proceeded without incident. When the hymns were sung, Zephyra joined in quietly. A few tears came during the sermon when Reverend Collins spoke of faith sustaining through hardship, but they were gentle tears, not the racking sobs of the previous week. Throughout, Yorick remained a steadying presence beside her. Afterward, as the congregation filtered into the churchyard, Reverend Collins approached them. "Mrs. Grant, Mr. Hawthorne, a fine morning for worship." "Indeed, Reverend," Zephyra replied. "I was pleased to see you both today." His kind eyes held understanding. "Mrs. Grant, the Ladies' Aid Society is meeting Tuesday to prepare care packages for the Calloway family after their barn fire. Your skills with needle and thread would be most welcome." Zephyra hesitated. She'd avoided social gatherings since Thomas's death, unwilling to face the mixture of pity and judgment. But something, perhaps Yorick's presence, perhaps her own changing heart, made her nod. "I'll be there, Reverend, thank you." "Excellent. And Mr. Hawthorne, I understand from Mr. Ferguson that you have quite the way with troubled horses. The church wagon team has been fractious of late. Might I impose upon you to take a look?" "Happy to," Yorick agreed. As the Reverend moved on to greet other parishioners, Yorick offered Zephyra his arm. "May I escort you home again, Mrs. Grant? Perhaps this time I might accept that coffee you offered." They walked unhurriedly through town, the bright October day lending a golden cast to everything. St. Louis looked almost pretty in this light, the rough edges softened, the promise of what it might become more apparent than its current limitations. At Zephyra's home, she bustled about preparing coffee while Yorick examined the small but tidy living room. His eyes lingered on Thomas's things still in their places. He was a tall man, Yorick observed, noting the boots by the door. Yes, 6 feet exactly. He used to joke that was the perfect height, tall enough to reach high shelves but not so tall as to constantly duck through doorways. The memory brought a smile rather than pain. They settled at her kitchen table with steaming cups. The domesticity of the moment struck Zephyra suddenly. How long had it been since she'd shared coffee with anyone in her own home? The simple pleasure of conversation over a hot drink had been among the many things grief had stolen from her. "I wanted to thank you for the book," she said. "The poems are beautiful. Found it at a shop in Cheyenne last year. Seemed like something you might appreciate." He sipped his coffee. "You have a thoughtful look about you, like you see more than most." "I'm not sure about that. Lately I've barely seen beyond my own sorrow." "That'll change with time. Already is, I'd wager." She studied him over the rim of her cup. Yorick Hawthorne was not conventionally handsome, but there was character in his face, laugh lines around eyes that had seen much, a strong jaw softened by a kind mouth. His hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, were work roughened but gentle in their movements. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Yorick, please, and yes, Yorick." His name felt comfortable on her lips. "Why have you never remarried? In 7 years, surely there have been opportunities." He considered the question, taking his time as was his way. "There have been women, if that's what you're asking, but marriage." He shook his head. "Catherine and I had something rare, understood each other without words sometimes. After losing that, ordinary connection seemed pale by comparison." "I understand," she said softly. "I can't imagine finding with anyone else what Thomas and I shared. Not the same, no, but different doesn't mean less." His eyes met hers. "Life has a way of surprising us if we leave the door open just a crack." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither was ready to name. Zephyra looked away first, her cheeks warming. "More coffee," she offered, rising to fetch the pot. "Thank you." As she refilled their cups, a knock sounded at the door. Zephyra opened it to find Mrs. Holloway, the mercantile owner's wife, standing on her porch with a covered dish. "Good afternoon, Zephyra. I brought you some." Mrs. Holloway stopped abruptly as she spotted Yorick at the kitchen table. Her eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Oh. I didn't realize you had company. Mr. Hawthorne kindly escorted me from church," Zephyra explained, conscious of how the situation must appear. "I see." Mrs. Holloway's tone suggested she saw entirely too much. "Well, I brought you some chicken and dumplings. Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal." "That's very kind, thank you." Zephyra accepted the dish, wishing she could explain, but knowing any explanation would only sound like justification. "Not at all, dear, we all need to look after each other, Mrs. Holloway's gaze flicked to Yorick, who had risen respectfully at her entrance. "Some more than others, it seems. Good day to you both." As the door closed behind her, Zephyra closed her eyes briefly, knowing what would follow. By evening, all of St. Louis would know Yorick Hawthorne had taken coffee in the Grant widow's kitchen. "I should go," Yorick said, reaching for his hat. "No sense giving the gossips more to chew on than they already have." "I'm sorry, small towns and their endless talk." She set the covered dish on the table with a sigh. "No need for apologies. I'm well acquainted with small-minded thinking." He paused at the door. "Will it cause trouble for you, my being here?" Zephyra considered the question. 6 months ago, she might have cared deeply about the town's opinion. Now she found it mattered less. "Nothing I can't weather," she decided, "though perhaps more discretion would be wise for both our sakes." He nodded. "Miller's Creek is peaceful most afternoons. No one to mind if 2 people happen to find themselves there at the same time. Indeed. A fine place for thinking or talking." His smile warmed his entire face. "Until next time, Zephyra." After he left, she stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared from view. The house felt different when she turned back to it, not empty exactly, but waiting. As if the rooms themselves had awakened to new possibilities. She uncovered Mrs. Holloway's dish and inhaled the savory aroma. For the first time in months, she found herself genuinely hungry. True to her word, Zephyra attended the Ladies' Aid Society meeting that Tuesday. The reception was mixed. Some women welcomed her warmly. Others maintained a cool distance, clearly having heard of Yorick's Sunday visit. Zephyra focused on her sewing, contributing a carefully pieced quilt square to the Calloway family's collection while deflecting personal questions with gentle redirection. "Such lovely stitches, Mrs. Grant," observed Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife. "One might think you've been practicing for a hope chest." Several women tittered at the implication. Zephyra kept her eyes on her needle. "I've always enjoyed sewing. My mother taught me when I was quite young." "Speaking of mothers, Mrs. Wilkinson interjected, "My Henry says the Hawthorne fellow never mentions his family." "Quite mysterious, wouldn't you say? One wonders what a man might be running from." "Or running to," countered Mrs. Collins, the Reverend's wife, with a pointed look. "Not everyone who comes west carries dark secrets, Martha. Some seek new beginnings. And some find them in unexpected places," added Mrs. Wilkinson with a meaningful glance at Zephyra. Before Zephyra could respond, Mrs. Collins changed the subject, asking about the winter preparations for the church. The moment passed, but Zephyra felt the undercurrents. Her friendship with Yorick, for that was what it was, she told herself firmly, had placed her at the center of the town's attention in a way her grief had not. The following weeks established a pattern. Sundays they sat together at church, their presence gradually becoming less noteworthy as the congregation adjusted to this new arrangement. 3 or 4 afternoons weekly, they met at Miller's Creek, sometimes fishing, sometimes simply talking. Occasionally, Yorick would bring a book and read aloud while Zephyra worked on mending or knitting. November arrived with bitter winds and the promise of snow. Their creek meetings became less comfortable as temperatures dropped, but neither suggested discontinuing them. Instead, they adapted, Yorick bringing hot coffee in a thermos, Zephyra packing extra blankets to sit upon. During one such meeting, as a particularly fierce gust rattled the nearly bare cottonwood branches above them, Yorick broached a subject they'd been circling for weeks. "Winter's coming hard," he observed, pouring her another cup of coffee. "These creek visits won't be practical much longer." Zephyra wrapped her gloved hands around the warm cup. "No, I suppose not. I've been thinking," he hesitated, unusually uncertain. "There's the social at Ferguson's barn next Saturday. Harvest celebration. I wondered if you might consider attending, with me." The invitation hung between them, weighted with significance. This would be no chance meeting or discreet conversation. This would be a public declaration of something. "As friends," he added quickly, seeing her hesitation. "Nothing more, but it seems a shame to limit our conversations to freezing creek banks when there's warm company to be had." Zephyra considered what it would mean. She hadn't attended any social functions since Thomas's death. To do so now, and with Yorick Hawthorne, would signal a definitive change in her life's direction. "People will talk," she said. "People already talk." True enough. She sipped her coffee, warming to the idea despite her reservations. "Will there be dancing?" "I expect so. Though I warn you, I've 2 left feet when it comes to anything fancier than a basic 2-step. "Thomas was the same," she said, smiling at the memory. "He used to say he'd rather break a wild Mustang than attempt a waltz. Sounds like a man who knew his limitations. Admirable quality." Yorick's expression grew serious. "Zephyra, if it's too soon—" "No," she interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "It's not too soon. I would be honored to attend the social with you, Yorick." His face brightened. "I'll call for you at 6 then, wear something festive." "Not," he gestured vaguely at her dark dress. "Not morning clothes," she finished for him. "I believe I can manage that." The day of the social arrived cold but clear. Zephyra spent the afternoon in an unusual state of nervous anticipation, trying on the few dresses she owned that weren't black or gray. She finally settled on a burgundy wool that she hadn't worn in over a year. The color brought warmth to her complexion, and when she arranged her hair in a softer style than usual, she hardly recognized the woman in the small mirror above her washstand. Precisely at 6, Yorick knocked at her door. When she opened it, he stood momentarily speechless, hat in hand, his eyes taking in the transformation. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Zephyra felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, you clean up rather well yourself." Indeed he did. Gone was the working ranch hand in favor of a man dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit well brushed, a crisp white shirt, hair neatly combed. He'd even trimmed his beard, revealing more of the strong jawline beneath. He helped her into her coat and offered his arm. "Ready as I'll ever be." The Ferguson ranch lay a mile outside town, its large barn already glowing with lantern light as they approached. The sound of fiddle music and laughter spilled into the night. Wagons and horses filled the yard, indicating most of the county had turned out for the celebration. Yorick squeezed her hand as they reached the barn door. "Remember, we're just 2 friends enjoying an evening out." "Is that what we are, friends?" Zephyra asked, suddenly needing clarity. His eyes held hers. "For now, unless you'd prefer otherwise." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then someone called Yorick's name, breaking the spell. "Hawthorne, didn't expect to see you here." Ferguson himself approached, a broad man with an equally broad smile. "And Mrs. Grant, what a pleasure. Come in, come in. Plenty of food and drink inside." They followed him into the barn, transformed for the occasion with strung lanterns, hay bales arranged for seating, and a cleared area for dancing. At one end, tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes brought by attendees. At the other, 3 musicians played a lively tune while couples whirled in time. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, heads turned, and whispers followed. Zephyra felt her resolve waver until Yorick's hand pressed gently at the small of her back, a silent reminder of his support. Mrs. Ferguson bustled over. "Zephyra Grant, as I live and breathe, how wonderful to see you out and about." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And with such handsome company. Yorick's been our finest horse trainer in years, you know, has a way with the stubborn ones." "So I've heard," Zephyra replied, grateful for the woman's easy acceptance. "Well, don't stand on ceremony. There's punch by the tables and we'll be serving supper shortly." "Yorick, be a dear and fetch Mrs. Grant a drink." As Yorick departed on this errand, Mrs. Ferguson leaned closer. "Don't mind the stares, dear. Half of them are just envious. It does my heart good to see you stepping back into life." Zephyra blinked, touched by the unexpected support. "Thank you." "It hasn't been easy." "Never is. Lost my first husband to a cattle stampede 30 years ago. Thought I'd die of grief myself. Then James came along and showed me there's room in a heart for more than one love." She patted Zephyra's hand. "Not saying that's where you're headed, mind. Just that life has chapters, and it looks like you're turning a page." Yorick returned with 2 cups of punch, and Mrs. Ferguson moved on to greet other guests. They found seats on hay bales near the edge of the dancing area, watching as couples twirled to a spirited reel. "Not quite what you expected?" Yorick asked, noting her expression. "I thought there would be more resistance." She nodded toward several townspeople who'd waved or smiled in greeting. "People surprise you sometimes, in good ways as well as bad." He set his empty cup aside. "Care to dance?" "I wasn't joking about my limited skills, but I can manage this one without stepping on your toes." "Probably." Zephyra hesitated only briefly before standing. "I'd like that." He led her onto the dance floor just as the musicians struck up a slower tune. Yorick placed one hand respectfully at her waist, taking her right hand in his left. They began to move to the gentle rhythm, a little stiffly at first, then with growing confidence. "You're not as terrible as you claimed," she observed as they completed a turn. "Evening's young. Plenty of time for me to prove my incompetence." She laughed, the sound surprising her. How long since she'd laughed freely? "I'll risk it." They danced 3 more songs before stopping for supper, joining a table with the Fergusons and several ranch hands and their wives. The conversation flowed easily around farming, weather, and local news. No one mentioned Thomas or questioned their attendance together, for which Zephyra was profoundly grateful. After the meal, while the musicians took a break, Ferguson called for attention and raised a toast to the harvest and the community. As glasses were lifted, Zephyra felt a sense of belonging she'd thought lost forever. She wasn't merely the grieving widow tonight, but a woman among friends, sharing in the season's celebrations. When the dancing resumed, Yorick was pulled into a discussion with Ferguson about a particularly difficult horse. Zephyra found herself approached by Reverend Collins. "Mrs. Grant, would you honor an old man with a dance?" "Hardly old, Reverend, but I'd be delighted." As they joined the other couples, Reverend Collins spoke quietly. "It does my heart good to see you here tonight. The Lord never intended us to walk alone through this life." "No, I suppose not. Though sometimes the path seems clearer that way, clearer perhaps, but infinitely lonelier." His kind eyes held understanding. "Mr. Hawthorne seems a decent man." "He is," she agreed, "a friend when I needed one most. Friendship is the foundation of all lasting bonds." The Reverend glanced toward where Yorick stood talking with Ferguson. "He carries his own sorrows, I think." "Yes, he lost his wife 7 years ago." "Ah, then he understands what others cannot." The dance ended, and the Reverend returned her to where Yorick waited. The evening continued with more dancing, laughter, and conversation. By the time they left, the moon had risen high, casting silver light across the frosted landscape. Yorick drove her home in a borrowed wagon, the night silent except for the horse's steady hoofbeats and the creak of wheels. Zephyra sat close beside him, a blanket across their laps against the cold. "Thank you," she said as they approached town. "I never expected to enjoy myself so much. No need for thanks. I had the prettiest dance partner there." She smiled at the compliment, aware of his solid presence beside her, the warmth where their shoulders touched. At her door, he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken words. "Would you like to come in?" she asked impulsively. "For coffee, or better not," he interrupted gently. Town's eyes are everywhere and your reputation matters. She knew he was right but felt disappointment nonetheless. When will I see you again? Sunday, of course. And perhaps tomorrow at Miller's Creek if you're of a mind to brave the cold. I am. She hesitated, then stood on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. Good night, Yorick, his expression softened. Good night, Zephyra. She watched him drive away, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As she prepared for bed that night, Zephyra found herself humming one of the dance tunes, her feet remembering the steps as she moved around her bedroom. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't feel guilty for experiencing joy. Progress, she thought, removing the burgundy dress and carefully hanging it for future wear. Definite progress. Winter descended in earnest the following week, bringing the first heavy snowfall of the season. Miller's Creek froze over, forcing Zephyra and Yorick to find new meeting places. Sometimes they walked along the main street, bundled against the cold. Other times they met at the church, where Reverend Collins had invited Yorick to help with repairs to the roof and bell tower. As Christmas approached, Zephyra found herself increasingly included in town activities, invited to help decorate the church, to contribute to the school's Christmas pageant, to join in caroling. She sensed that her appearance at the harvest social with Yorick had somehow granted permission for the town to treat her as something other than a tragic figure. 2 weeks before Christmas, Zephyra was at the mercantile sorting through a new shipment of goods when the bell jangled and Yorick entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Afternoon, Mrs. Grant," he greeted her formally, aware of Mr. Holloway watching from behind the counter. "Mr. Hawthorne. What can I help you with today? Looking for something special, a Christmas gift?" His eyes held a message meant only for her. "We have several suitable items. Perhaps you could tell me about the recipient." He followed her lead, adopting a considering expression. "A lady of refined tastes. Appreciates beautiful things but isn't frivolous. I see." She showed him several items: gloves, a knitted scarf, a decorative hair comb. As he examined each, their fingers brushed, sending warmth through her despite the shop's chill. The comb, I think, he decided. Simple but elegant. As she wrapped it in tissue paper, Zephyra wondered if it truly was intended for her, or if the entire exchange had been a pretense to see her. She wrote up the sales receipt with careful penmanship, trying to ignore Mr. Holloway's curious gaze. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, handing him the small package. "Just one thing." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Ferguson's having the hands over for Christmas Eve supper. Asked me to extend an invitation to you as well, said Mrs. Ferguson insists." Zephyra glanced at Mr. Holloway, who made no effort to disguise his eavesdropping. "That's very kind. Please tell them I'd be delighted. I'll call for you at 4 then." Yorick touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Grant." After he left, Mr. Holloway approached, eyebrows raised. "Seems you've made quite an impression on the Ferguson ranch, Mrs. Grant." "Mrs. Ferguson has been very kind since the harvest social," Zephyra replied neutrally. "MMM. And Hawthorne seems to find many reasons to visit town these days." His tone was speculative rather than disapproving. "My wife thinks it's good to see you getting on with life." "Does she?" Zephyra busied herself with straightening the counter display. "Indeed. Says 6 months is a respectable mourning period, especially for someone your age." He patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Thomas was a good man, but he wouldn't have wanted you to be alone forever." The unexpected support brought tears to Zephyra's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway, that means a great deal." He nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional moment, and retreated to his ledgers. Zephyra turned back to her work, a curious lightness in her chest. It seemed the town's opinion was shifting, or perhaps it had never been as condemning as she'd feared. Christmas Eve arrived with perfect winter weather, fresh snow blanketing the landscape, the sky a clear, deep blue, the air crisp but not bitter. Yorick collected Zephyra in the same borrowed wagon, now fitted with runners for the snow. She'd spent hours on her appearance, selecting a forest green dress with subtle lace at the collar and cuffs, arranging her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple bun. "You look lovely," he said as she settled beside him under the lap blankets. "Green suits you." "Thank you." She noticed he wore a new scarf, clearly a recent purchase. "The blue brings out your eyes." The drive to the Ferguson ranch passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation about the town's Christmas preparations and plans for the new year. Zephyra found herself speaking of the future with anticipation rather than dread a significant change from even a month earlier. The Ferguson home glowed with welcome, windows bright with lamplight, a wreath of pine boughs on the door. Inside, a dozen people gathered in the spacious main room where a tall spruce stood decorated with paper stars, strings of cranberries, and small carved wooden ornaments. "Zephyra, Yorick, come in, come in," Mrs. Ferguson ushered them forward. "Let me take your coats. Supper's nearly ready, but first, drinks by the fire." The evening unfolded in a haze of warmth and goodwill. The meal was abundant: roast goose, potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the fall harvest, and 3 different pies for dessert. Afterward, they gathered around the piano where Mrs. Ferguson played carols while everyone sang, some more tunefully than others. As the evening progressed, Zephyra found herself seated beside Yorick on a small sofa, their shoulders touching, watching as Ferguson told animated stories of Christmases past that had everyone laughing. The domesticity of the scene, the decorated tree, the crackling fire, friends sharing joy, brought a bittersweet pang. This was what she and Thomas had dreamed of creating, a home filled with love and laughter. Yorick seemed to sense her thoughts. His hand found hers beneath the blanket someone had spread across their laps, his fingers intertwining with hers in silent understanding. Later, as they prepared to leave, Mrs. Ferguson pressed a small package into Zephyra's hands. "A little something for Christmas morning. For both of you," she added with a meaningful glance at Yorick. On the drive home, the night sky blazed with stars, the snow reflecting their light until the whole world seemed to shimmer. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in private thoughts. "I have something for you," Yorick said as they approached town. "Been carrying it around for days, waiting for the right moment." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Zephyra recognized it immediately as the one she'd wrapped at the mercantile. "The hair comb," she said, smiling, "so it was for me after all." "Who else?" He handed it to her. "Merry Christmas, Zephyra." She unwrapped it carefully. The comb was silver, a simple design with small pearls inset along the edge, elegant but not ostentatious. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Reminded me of you, practical but still has a shine to it." Zephyra laughed softly. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment." "Highest one I know how to give." His expression grew serious. "I have something else for you too, not a gift exactly, more of a question." Her heart quickened. "Yes. Been thinking about spring. Ferguson's offered me a permanent position foreman starting in March when old Jenkins retires." He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "Means I'd be staying in St. Louis, building something lasting maybe." "That's wonderful news," she said, understanding the significance of this decision for a man who drifted for years. "Thing is," he continued carefully, "a foreman should have a proper home, not just a room at the bunkhouse. Got my eye on the old Miller place at the edge of town. Needs work, but it has good bones, enough land for a garden, maybe some chickens." He paused. "Too much house for one person, though." Zephyra's breath caught as his meaning became clear. "Yorick. Not asking for any answers tonight," he hurried to add. "Just wanted you to know I'm thinking of the future, a future that includes you if you're willing." They had reached her house. Yorick helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist. In the starlight, his expression was a mixture of hope and vulnerability that touched her deeply. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching into her coat pocket. "It isn't much." She handed him a small cloth pouch. Inside was a pocket watch, silver, well-worn but polished to a soft gleam. "It was Thomas's," she explained as Yorick held it reverently. "His father's before that. I've kept it wound, but it should belong to someone who'll use it." She took a deep breath. "Someone who understands that time moves forward, even when we wish it wouldn't." Yorick's eyes met hers, comprehending the profound meaning behind the gift. "Are you certain?" "I am." She stepped closer. "Thomas would have liked you, I think. He always said life was for the living. Wise man." Yorick carefully tucked the watch into his vest pocket. "I'll treasure it and the sentiment behind it." They stood in the silent night, snowflakes beginning to drift down around them, the moment suspended between past and future. Then Yorick leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, a question more than a demand. When Zephyra responded, the kiss deepened, becoming a promise. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed despite the cold, Yorick rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Zephyra. Merry Christmas, Yorick." Inside her home, after Yorick had departed with a promise to call the following day, Zephyra lit a lamp and unwrapped Mrs. Ferguson's gift. It was a framed needlework, simply but beautifully executed. The words stitched in elegant script read, "Love is patient, love is kind, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." Zephyra traced the words with her fingertips, understanding Mrs. Ferguson's message. Love wasn't a finite resource. The love she'd shared with Thomas would always be part of her, but her heart had room for more, for new beginnings, new hopes, new joy. She placed the framed verse on her mantle, next to the daguerreotype of Thomas. They didn't seem at odds with each other, but rather complementary pieces of a life being rewoven into something new, yet still honoring what had come before. As she prepared for bed, Zephyra remembered that Sunday months ago when she'd wept in church and a stranger had sat beside her, offering the simple comfort of shared tears. "Then I'll cry beside you too," he'd said. Such a small gesture, yet it had opened the door to healing in a way nothing else had managed. She said a silent prayer of gratitude for tears that cleansed, for kindness freely given, and for hearts resilient enough to love again. The new year brought change to St. Louis. January passed in a blur of winter storms and quiet evenings. Yorick visited Zephyra regularly now, their courtship acknowledged and largely accepted by the townspeople. They attended church together, shared Sunday dinners, and often spent evenings reading or talking by her fire. In February, Yorick began renovations on the Miller property. Zephyra helped choose paint colors and fabrics, each decision a step toward the future they were carefully building together. When the weather permitted, they walked the land, planning garden plots and discussing where fruit trees might be planted come spring. "Apples here," Yorick would say, gesturing to a sunny slope, "and maybe plums along the fence line." "We won't see fruit for years," Zephyra pointed out one afternoon as they traced paths through the snow. "I'm counting on being around for those years." His eyes held hers, all of them. By March, the worst of winter had passed. Yorick moved into the renovated house and assumed his new position as Ferguson's foreman. The promotion brought increased responsibilities, but also respect from the community. No longer the drifter of uncertain background, he became Mr. Hawthorne, who managed the territory's largest ranch, who spoke at town meetings, who had opinions worth considering on matters from water rights to road improvements. One Sunday in early April after church service, Yorick asked Zephyra to accompany him to the cemetery. They walked in companionable silence through rows of markers until they reached Thomas's grave. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with his name, dates, and the words "beloved husband." Yorick stood respectfully as Zephyra placed the spring flowers she'd brought. She touched the stone briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than grief. "I come here less often now," she admitted. "Not because I'm forgetting, but because I carry him with me in different ways." "That's as it should be." Yorick's voice was gentle. "The dead live on in how they shaped us, not in how long we mourn them." She turned to face him. "Why did you want to come here today?" Seemed right. He took her hands in his, wanted to do this properly, with respect for what came before. Zephyra's heart quickened as understanding dawned. Yorick drew a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "Zephyra Grant, I love you, not in spite of your past but including it. Everything you've experienced has made you the woman. You are the woman I want to share my life with." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Will you marry me, make a new beginning with me while honoring all that's come before?" Inside the box was a ring not ostentatious but beautifully crafted, a small sapphire set in silver. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She'd want you to have it." Tears filled Zephyra's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes, I will marry you, Yorick Hawthorne." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that sealed their promise. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. "Seems fitting," Yorick said, glancing at the surrounding graves. "Life affirmed in a place of endings reminds us to cherish every day." They walked back to town hand in hand, stopping to share their news with Reverend and Mrs. Collins, who offered immediate congratulations and blessings. "We were hoping this day would come," Mrs. Collins said, embracing Zephyra. "You both deserve happiness." "Would June be too soon for a wedding?" Reverend Collins asked. "The church garden should be in full bloom by then." Zephyra looked to Yorick, who squeezed her hand. June would be perfect, she decided. A new beginning with summer. News of their engagement spread quickly through St. Louis. Most reactions were positive congratulatory notes, small gifts, offers of help with wedding preparations. A few disapproving glances came from those who felt Zephyra had not mourned long enough, but they were far outnumbered by well-wishers. The weeks leading to their June wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Zephyra sewed a new dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Cheyenne. Mrs. Ferguson and the church ladies organized flowers and food. Yorick completed the final renovations to their future home, including a special surprise, a library nook with built-in shelves for Zephyra's growing book collection. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, the church garden resplendent with early summer blooms. Zephyra dressed with Mrs. Collins's help, the older woman fastening the pearl-edged comb Yorick had given her at Christmas into her upswept hair. "You look radiant, my dear, Mrs. Collins said, stepping back to admire the effect. "A bride should glow, and you certainly do." At the appointed hour, Zephyra walked alone down the garden path that served as an aisle. She had considered asking Mr. Holloway to give her away, but ultimately decided to come to Yorick on her own terms, a woman making a choice, rather than being given by one man to another. Yorick waited beneath an arch of roses, tall and straight in a new suit, his face lighting with wonder as she approached. Beside him stood Ferguson as best man, beaming with pride at the union he'd helped foster. Reverend Collins welcomed the gathered townspeople and began the ceremony with words about new beginnings and enduring love. When it came time for their vows, Yorick took both her hands in his voice steady and clear. "Zephyra, I promise to walk beside you through all of life's joys and sorrows, to cry with you when tears come, to laugh with you in moments of happiness, and to face whatever the future holds together. I give you my name, my heart, and my loyalty for all the days we're granted." Zephyra's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "Yorick, I promise to embrace each day with you as the gift it is, to honor our past while building our future, to stand beside you in all seasons and to love you with a heart that knows the value of time. I give you my trust, my faith, and my love for as long as we both shall live." They exchanged rings, Yorick's a simple gold band, Zephyra wearing both her new ring and her band from Thomas. They had discussed this at length and agreed that carrying this symbol of her first love didn't diminish what they were creating together. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Collins pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Their kiss was gentle but profound, sealing promises made not just with words but with the journey that had brought them to this moment. The celebration afterward was joyous tables set up in the garden, music from local fiddle players, dancing and feasting until sunset. As twilight descended, Yorick and Zephyra slipped away to their home, now truly theirs together. On the porch, Yorick swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold to laughter and kisses. Inside, he set her down gently, his expression suddenly serious. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, the name still new and wonderful between them. "Home," she echoed, looking around at the house they would fill with their shared life. "I like the sound of that." Later, as moonlight filtered through curtains Zephyra had sewn herself, they lay tangled together, learning each other in the most intimate ways. Their coming together was tender yet passionate, two people who had known loss finding joy in each other's arms, each touch a promise, each kiss an affirmation. "I never expected this," Zephyra whispered against his shoulder, "to feel so complete again." "Nor I." Yorick stroked her hair, his touch reverent. "Life has strange and wonderful paths if we're brave enough to follow them." Summer flowed into autumn, their first season as husband and wife, bringing a harmony to their days that neither had dared hope for again. They established routines and traditions: Sunday dinners with friends, evening readings by the fire, morning coffees on the porch watching sunrise paint the distant mountains. Yorick's work kept him busy, especially during roundup and branding. But he always returned to her with stories and small gifts, a wildflower pressed in his notebook, a curious stone from a creek bed, once a tiny abandoned bird's nest perfectly formed. Zephyra divided her time between homemaking and community involvement. She continued working part-time at the mercantile, started a reading circle for the town's women, and volunteered at the small school, teaching needlework to young girls. Her grief, once all-consuming, became a quiet undercurrent rather than the defining feature of her days. In November, as the first snows threatened, Zephyra discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation. At 32, she was older than most first-time mothers in the territory. When she told Yorick, his reaction banished any fears. He dropped to his knees before her chair, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our child. Are you happy?" she asked, running her fingers through his hair. He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Beyond words, a family, Zephyra, something I'd given up hoping for." The pregnancy progressed without complications through the winter months. As Zephyra's body changed, Yorick treated her with tender care, insisting she rest when tired, bringing special treats from town, reading to her in the evenings when her own eyes grew too weary for books. Their first Christmas as husband and wife was quietly joyful. They decorated a small pine tree cut from their own land, exchanged modest gifts, and hosted dinner for the Fergusons and Collins. The evening ended with carols around their fireplace, Zephyra's hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, feeling the occasional flutter of movement from the new life within. "Next Christmas we'll have little hands helping decorate," Yorick observed as they prepared for bed. "And little ears for your stories," she added, smiling at the thought. The weeks passed in peaceful anticipation. Zephyra sewed baby clothes and blankets. Yorick built a cradle from pine wood, carving delicate leaf patterns along its edges. Together they prepared a small room adjoining theirs, painting the walls a soft yellow for either a boy or girl, as Yorick insisted, wanting the gender to remain a surprise. Spring came early that year. By April, green shoots pushed through the soil in the garden Yorick had tilled for Zephyra. The fruit trees they'd planted the previous year showed promising buds. Life renewed itself all around them as they awaited their own miracle. On a warm evening in late May, with wildflowers dotting the prairie beyond their window, Zephyra's labor began. Mrs. Collins came to assist, along with the midwife from the next town over. Yorick paced outside their bedroom, alternately praying and cursing as Zephyra's cries pierced the night. Shortly after dawn, a new cry joined hers, the indignant wail of a healthy baby entering the world. Mrs. Collins opened the bedroom door, her face tired but radiant. "Mr. Hawthorne, come meet your daughter." He entered to find Zephyra propped against pillows, exhausted but glowing, a small bundle cradled in her arms. As he approached, she turned back the blanket to reveal a perfect, tiny face framed by wisps of dark hair. "Catherine," she said softly, "after your first wife, if that's all right, to honor what came before." Tears spilled down Yorick's cheeks as he gathered both of them gently in his arms. "More than all right, it's perfect, she's perfect, you're perfect." "Not quite," Zephyra laughed weakly, "but we're a family now, complete." "Yes," he agreed, kissing her forehead, then their daughters, completely blessed. As the sun rose higher, painting their bedroom with golden light, they marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance meeting in a church where a widow's tears had moved a stranger to compassion, to this new life created from their love. "I'll cry beside you too," Yorick had said that day, offering the simple gift of shared humanity. Neither could have imagined then where that moment would lead to healing, to love, to family, to home. Outside their window, St. Louis was awakening to another day. Inside, the Hawthornes welcomed their future with open hearts, knowing that whatever joys or sorrows lay ahead, they would face them together, two people who had learned that grief might bend the spirit, but love could make it soar again. Catherine Elizabeth Hawthorne grew into a strong, curious child with her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle smile. By her second birthday, she had a brother, Thomas Yorick, named in honor of two good men. The Hawthorne home became known throughout the county for its warmth and hospitality, its doors always open to friends and strangers alike. On summer evenings, neighbors would often gather on their wide porch to share stories and music. Yorick, never much for singing, would nevertheless join in when Zephyra led familiar hymns, his deep voice providing foundation for her clear soprano. And sometimes, when the moment was right, they would exchange a glance that spoke volumes, remembering a church service long ago where a widow wept and a cowboy offered the most precious gift: the courage to feel, to grieve, to heal, and ultimately to love again.